Today, Tim and his family are all out sick, so we've kind of been scrambling around a little with that. But we started, I almost said speaking in tongues last week, but we actually didn't start speaking in tongues. We just started a lesson on it last week and getting into some of the scriptures. And if you haven't been here for, actually, I think we started that, but understand we're looking at the nature of what Scripture says regarding the spiritual gift of speaking in tongues. And when we look at that and compare it to some of the religious practices of other churches, what we will find, and we've already been noticing, I hope, is that what they're doing contradicts what Paul gives as instruction in 1 Corinthians 14. And whenever we're doing anything, the challenge is to do it in the most pleasing way to God as we possibly can. I had a discussion, actually I've had this discussion twice over the last couple of weeks with people, but the nature of this topical study that we're doing, controversial issues, is not so that we stir you up to get mad at the preacher or at each other or to bring condemnation. It's, in fact, just the opposite. It's to make sure that we're not placing condemnation in places that God didn't place condemnation. That we're not calling something sinful or wicked that God did not call sinful or wicked. We have a tendency where we have been taught that certain things, if the Bible doesn't say it, we don't do it. And that's not a bad practice. That's called playing it safe. However, what that turns into over time is, if we're not doing it, you doing it makes it sin. But that's not accurate. There are things, when we were talking about polygamy a few weeks ago, one of the things that we had to address was the fact that even though Jesus repeats something from Genesis on this is how God intended in the beginning, and he talks about man leaving his father and mother, clinging to his wife, if we are trying to do it the way we believe God intended it, then monogamy is a great way to see that. We believe that's what he's getting at. However, to come up and say, so it's sinful if you have multiple wives. The problem is the Bible doesn't actually say that. So we have taken something saying this is what God intended and decided, well, if this is what God intended, even though it doesn't call it sinful, if you contradict this, you're sinning or you're wicked or you're evil. And that's what we better be very careful of. Because we get into that, who are you to judge another man's servant? He gets to decide whether they stand or fall. And here we're judging a lot of people that are serving God and deciding we have the right to call something sinful or evil or wicked that God has not done so with. So that's what this is about, making sure that we are properly, rightly dividing the word of truth to see what it really says. It's not to promote that we start adding certain things into the church. I believe there's a lot to be said for playing it safe so that we are trying to appeal to God in the best way possible. When we get to speaking in tongues, part of what we covered last week was the fact that one of the teachings out there, even in the Church of Christ, is that spiritual gifts like this ended years ago. Well, the problem is the Bible doesn't say that. We're going to look at that scripture some tonight, or this morning, not tonight. It does make comments about speaking in tongues and how to do it, but when we eliminate one spiritual gift because of a scripture we take out of context, the problem is we leave room to say there are no spiritual gifts. So you can't take a blanket statement about gifts ceasing without eliminating all gifts. If you try to argue that one's gone, you've basically argued that they're all gone. We don't get to decide which gifts are still here and which ones aren't just because that's what we've been taught. So this is, I hope that all makes sense. We're trying to see what does the Bible actually say concerning these topics. So where we left off last week was, is speaking in tongues speaking an angelic language? Anybody ever heard this? You know, it starts off, to speak in tongues is not to speak to man, but to speak to God. Sounds great. That's 1 Corinthians 14. Sounds great if I just stopped right there. But the problem is, Paul is not saying that in a positive way. He goes on to finish that chapter, as we've been looking at, to say, You're not there to just speak to God. If you're in the service, you are there to encourage and uplift the congregation. If nobody knows what you're saying, what good are you? So we have to make sure that we see what it actually says. So we're going to go back to 1 Corinthians 13 this morning. 1 Corinthians 13, and I want to start with the scripture I was just alluding to a minute ago. Verse 8. We're going to read 8 through 10 here. It says, love never fails. But whether there are prophecies, they will fail. Whether there are tongues, they will cease. Whether there is knowledge, it will vanish away. Whether there is knowledge, it will vanish away. I read that twice, sorry. For we know in part and we prophesy in part, but when that which is perfect has come, then that which is in part will be done away. So, here we have three things, right? Prophecies, they will fail. Tongues, they will cease. Whether there is knowledge, it will pass away, vanish away. So who believes that the miracle of speaking in tongues, the ability to do that, that spiritual gift has passed away? Couple willing to raise their hand, even though more than that might, right? Why? It says it will, but what else does it say? When will these things happen?
When it's perfect.
When the perfect, but when that which is perfect has come. What is that?
Well, that's the interpretation. It's either Christ coming or the perfect law of liberty, which is the New Testament.
All right, so y'all hear him? A couple of ideas is the perfect representing Jesus Christ when he comes. Well, we ought to add this when he comes again, because when Paul says this to the Corinthian church, he's already come once. So if this is all a standard of when Christ comes again, then have tongues ceased?
Right.
Oh, see, in that case, we can't really say that tongues have ceased because Jesus hasn't come back. It also talks about that which is in part will be done away. Well, he said, well, if it's the law of liberty which has come, well, when did the law of liberty take effect? Not under the old law, right? Law of Christ what? Yeah, I'm going to take it forward a few days, but his resurrection brings the new law, that new covenant, So, again, here we're faced with the problem of this. If tongues will cease then that meant they are already gone because Christ has already been resurrected by the time Paul writes the Corinthian letter. So if we're talking about when Christ came, then everything's still intact. If we're talking about when the law came, the new covenant comes, well, that's already in effect by the time Paul writes this. So actually, neither one of those would disqualify this at all.
Yes, it's after Pentecost, but what's a modern day prophet? Is there a modern day prophet?
We're going to get into that. But again, once we start bunching stuff together to accommodate, we get ourselves in trouble because we're trying to force something in there that's not actually there. Now, again, I'm not telling you yes or no yet. I'm just pointing out our flaw in translating these scriptures that way.
I just wanted to point out, I know the New Testament came when the resurrection of Christ happened.